During the 5 years of the New Deal, from 1933 to 1938, there were more changes to the country from the federal government than at any comparable period in U.S. history in a time of peace. Times of war, totally different. But in a time of peace, the changes to the United States from the federal government were unparalleled. So, since the New Deal occurred, for the last 90 years, it has been insanely controversial. People have really strong opinions, usually emotional opinions, about FDR and the New Deal, and it is almost entirely based on people's ideology and whether they are liberal, conservative, Democrat, or Republican. People have intensely strong opinions without actually knowing much about it. So that's why it is so important to know about the New Deal. And there are things to criticize about it. There are a lot of legitimate ways to criticize it. A couple things that no one should say. One, it was socialist. That's just dumb. There was no part of the U.S. economy that was nationalized. And there's a lot of things that could have been. There's a lot of places in the world that were they did nationalize. It did not happen in the United States. So don't call it socialism. Definitely don't call it communism. It's what Huey Long wanted, and it did not do anything that was socialist or communist. Also, don't say the New Deal is bad. That just is ridiculous, since there are so many programs. And some of the programs worked, some of the programs didn't work. And there are some programs that, I don't care who it is, everyone will like part of the New Deal. Everyone will like some parts of the New Deal. And the third thing that no one should say is that the New Deal did not help, because for millions and millions of Americans, it helped them a lot. For homeowners, for farmers, for the unemployed, for a ton of Americans, it was helpful. And that is why they voted so overwhelmingly for it. It is ahistoric to say the New Deal was bad. Now, if you're talking about just like what it did for the economy, that's totally different. But to say that the vast majority of American people were just wrong and that it helped it, you have to ignore all the New Deal programs and who they were helping and what they did. Now, in terms of how to criticize it correctly, obviously, conservatives tend to not like it because fundamentally it's big government, and that is accurate. Federal government grew incredibly large, so just that general idea of big government. Another reason to criticize it from a conservative perspective is debts and deficits, and that's legitimate. FDR never once had a balanced budget. And ran deficits the entire time. We'll come back to that. Some people criticize it because of subsidies to farmers, and no part of the economy should be permanently subsidized by the federal government, which agriculture is. Some people don't like it because of the Tennessee Valley Authority, government in economic competition with private companies. You can criticize it for people that are anti-union, that hate everything about unions and think they should not exist. Obviously, they don't like the New Deal because of the Wagner Act. There are people that are anti-regulation, do not think banks and financial institutions should be regulated. They don't like it. The biggest criticism of the New Deal, though, and the one that is most consistent, is it created the welfare state that we know of. it created a lot of the welfare programs. It is the beginning of what will become food stamps. It is the first time the federal government will provide direct relief to Americans, to a lot of Americans. And there are things to criticize about the welfare system. The most consistent criticism that you will hear about welfare, though, is it makes people lazy and dependent. So Hoover said, even FDR said that. When he was killing the CWA, he said that explicitly. And is there truth to that? I'm sure there is. Most people have family members that are on welfare and have been their entire life and don't even try to get a job. So it can. But, and this is an important thing to remember, this is the first generation of Americans that ever received welfare from the federal government. Does anyone consider this generation lazy? Absolutely not. They are called the greatest generation for a reason. They will live through the worst economic collapse in human history that was much worse than most people realize. And they live through and fight World War II, and the level of sacrifices there are amazing. And then they create the best economy the world has ever seen post-World War II. So, can it make people lazy? Yes, but it does not have to. And there is no way you can say the New Deal made that generation, the first welfare generation, lazy. Obviously, welfare can go too far, and that is a legitimate critique as well. So, welfare can always be taken too far. Ironically, the part of welfare that has been taken too far, though, is not the part that most people think. It is Social Security and Medicare. Those are the ones that they have just exploded, and they have gone far beyond anything that they were meant to be. Social Security and Medicare alone account for the vast majority of the U.S. budget, and those are welfare measures. No matter what anyone says, those are welfare measures. Now, don't get me wrong also. I am not saying that we need to cut them. I am not making any recommendations. When people say welfare, they always tend to think of just giving money to poor people, but that is not just what welfare is. This is the U.S. spending in 2023, and most people look at welfare as helping the poor, and the part of the U.S. budget that has grown just exponentially is helping the elderly. If you want to know why, it's because they vote. Young people don't vote. That's why the U.S. economy does not work for young people. It generally does not work for poor people. So there are legitimate critiques from the political right, but there are also legitimate critiques there are critiques from the political left too. Some of the biggest critiques of the New Deal came from people that were to the left of FDR, or on the far liberal side. And they especially came out in the 1960s. They are called the New Left. Throughout the 1960s and since, there have been a lot of criticism of the New Deal because it did not go far enough. The Great Depression was an opportunity to have massive changes in the system. And what the New Left has argued then and since is that FDR didn't go far enough. He has been accused of the New Left being a closet conservative that was just trying to keep capitalism stable. And they criticize him for not fundamentally altering capitalism or fundamentally altering race relations. The story of the New Deal is a sad story, the ever-recurring story of what might have been. The New Deal failed to solve the problem of depression. It's true. It failed to raise the impoverished. It failed to redistribute income. It failed to extend equality and generally countenance racial discrimination and segregation. That is all accurate. None of that is wrong. What's incorrect is calling him a closet conservative. Roosevelt was very clear. He was trying to stabilize capitalism. He was not trying to fundamentally alter the United States. He was not trying to fundamentally alter capitalism. He was not trying to redistribute the wealth. That was never his objective. That is why it was called the New Deal. And so the only thing that's wrong about it, well, two things. One is that, three things. One is that he was a closet conservative. He wasn't. He made it very clear he was trying to conserve capitalism and representative democracy. Two, that also he had the authority to. The American people elected him to make those massive changes. They didn't. So he didn't have a mandate to go that far. And third, that he had the power to. This is what people get so wrong. I think presidents in the United States are dictators, and they are able to undo that. Roosevelt depended on Southern Democrats because Southern Democrats controlled Congress more than any other region. And so he could not have done those things even if he wanted to. So there are ways to criticize the New Deal, but those arguments I don't think hold much water. So what did the New Deal do then? What are the New Deal accomplishments? In the short term, did the New Deal get the United States out of the Great Depression? Absolutely not. And that is undisputable, and everyone agrees on that. Everyone agrees the New Deal did not. Now, what you will always hear people say is the New Deal did get us out of the Depression, World War II did. And that is accurate. But why? That's usually where they stop. Why, though? Does shooting a German and dropping a bomb on a Japanese city make the U.S. economy go up? Obviously not. What was it about World War II that did it? Federal spending. Saying the World War II did it and the New Deal did not, that is accurate. But what it fundamentally does is endorses the idea of federal spending, government expenditures, to alleviate an economic collapse. Because the reason World War II did is because of how much money was spent. The amount of money spent during World War II was unprecedented in all of U.S. history. At the height of the New Deal, the biggest deficit that ran in the entire New Deal is 1936, $4.3 billion. That was 12 times less than the biggest deficit in World War II, $54.5 billion. The amount of money that was spent in World War II in just 4 years, from 1941 to 1945, was more than in all of U.S. history combined, including the Civil War and World War I. If you remember, World War I, more money was spent than in all of U.S. history combined. World War II, more money was spent than all of U.S. history combined, including World War I and the Civil War. It is an unprecedented amount of money. So what got the United States what got it out of the U.S. Or out of the Great Depression was federal government spending. The U.S. government became the largest, most consistent consumer the United States had ever had. And we'll talk about this later, but it is the arsenal of democracy, so it's buying stuff from everywhere in the country, not just war materials. It is buying food, it is buying from farmers, it is buying mattresses, it is buying everything from everywhere. So the U.S. government became the largest consumer. That is what got the U.S. out of the Depression, is federal government spending. So here's a question. Could the United States have gotten out of the Great Depression if it had spent more during the New Deal? Could we get ourselves could the U.S. get itself out of a depression by spending enough in a time of peace? Hypothetically, yes, but I don't think it would ever happen. There would be too much, there's always just too much opposition. When it comes to war, sure, spend like crazy. When it comes to time of peace, Americans are not fond of spending. So in the short term, what did the New Deal do? It got the United States through the Great Depression. It got the United States through the worst economic collapse in human history. And it did that without fundamentally altering capitalism or representative democracy. It did it by maintaining the United States fundamentals as much as possible. And it did it without redistributing the wealth. Wealth distribution in the United States was the same in 1920 as it was in 1930 as it was in 1940. It was virtually unchanged. No one got rich working New Deal relief programs, and no one got poor. No one became poor because of the New Deal. People got poor because of the Great Depression, but no one changed economic positions because of the New Deal. It stabilized. No farmers got rich. It stabilized farmers, stabilized homeowners, stabilized people that were starving to death. It stabilized the system, and it undermined extremism. And that is a huge accomplishment, because during this decade we had the decline of democracy everywhere in the world. All over the world, it was being replaced. And that is a major, major accomplishment. Democracy has disappeared in several other great nations, not because the people in those nations disliked democracy, but because they had grown tired of unemployment and insecurity, of seeing their children hungry while they sat helpless in the face of government confusion and government weakness through lack of leadership in government. History proves that dictatorships do not grow out of a strong and successful government, but out of a weak and helpless one. And that is accurate. So that is a major accomplishment, that it got America through that depression. That is the short-term, really important accomplishment of the New Deal. What about long-term? Long-term, the New Deal, for one, it created a new electoral coalition. Political parties would never be the same after this. It is not, again, there's no one key event that changes the parties, but the New Deal was fundamental in changing the parties for a while. And it changes them dramatically. The urban population had supported Democrats before, but more did now. A lot of farmers had supported Democrats, but even more did. Labor unions became overwhelmingly supportive of Democrats, which they still are. Senior citizens overwhelmingly became Democrats, which they are not anymore. Women overwhelmingly supported the New Deal. South had been Democrats for forever, since the creation of the Democratic Party, largely. Catholics, Jews, and African Americans. So it is a crucial event in changing the parties. Most importantly, though, what the New Deal did long term is it created the longest period of stability and security in U.S. history. If you ever are studying U.S. economic history, there's history classes where you just study the economics of the United States. The period from 1933 to 1980 is the period of the most stability, the least economic collapses, the least amount of banking closures, the most stable period in U.S. history. It stabilized the banking and financial sectors. It's created stability for vulnerable individuals, elderly and unemployable people that were temporarily out of work. Created stability for workers and laborers, created stability for the middle class, for farmers, made the environment more stable. We had just created a massive desert in the middle of the country, and the New Deal, it cured it. It made that whole area, the environment, livable. And it made the United States infrastructure more stable. One of the most important legacies of the New Deal is it put it gave electricity to rural areas. It made it so people's homes and land weren't being flooded all the time with dams. Provided electricity, provided fresh water, provided road system. It created an infrastructure system, and all these things are absolutely essential in creating long-term stability for the majority of Americans. Part of the reason the United States was able to militarize so fast when World War II comes is because the infrastructure was already in place to create all the military bases. There was the electricity, the water, and really importantly, when we get to after World War II, the United States will have the strongest economy in the history of the world. It's called the Golden Age of Capitalism from 1945 to 1973. It is the greatest economy in all of human history. And a big reason was because of the programs that had been established during the New Deal. So it will create an unprecedented level of stability that will last for about 50 years until we start undoing a lot of it. Finally, the New Deal was a period of collectivism. Now, the United States is the most individualistic country in the world. And there's a lot of ways to measure that, and there's a lot of data to support it. That's not subjective opinion. It is one of the most individualistic countries, and that is a good thing. But it goes through periods where it is too individualistic. And when we go through those periods of too much individualism, it results in catastrophe or crisis. 1850s, right before the Civil War, was a period. 1920s was a period. And, fun fact, we are going through another one of those periods right now. Individualism, it leads to collectivism. And again, these things, collectivism has good aspects and bad aspects. Individualism has good aspects and bad aspects. But during the New Deal, we became more collectivistic. Why do all Americans have to pay for agriculture? Why do all Americans have to pay into a system to help 18 to 25-year-old men and World War I veterans to do conservation of the environment? Why do we all have to pay into a social security system? It's because fundamentally, during the New Deal, the majority of Americans came to see us as all in this together. We had all experienced the Great Depression and suffered from it. So, solution out of it was everyone sacrifices a little bit for everyone else. Again, collectivism, it definitely can go too far, but so can individualism. So we will become a more collectivistic country during the New Deal. But the level of collectivism that we experience during the New Deal is not anything compared to what we'll have during World War II. The most collectivistic the United States has ever been in its history.